Imagine you have a smartphone sitting in your pocket. It tells time automatically. It connects to satellites. It updates itself. It can measure your location, your heart rate, your sleep, your messages, your calls. And it can do all of that for a fraction of the price of some mechanical watches. Yet someone can walk into a luxury watch store and spend thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, on a Rolex, a device that does almost nothing except tell time. So here's the question. Why? Why would anyone pay so much for something that technology can replace so easily? Is it because Rolex uses expensive materials? Is it because every watch is assembled by highly trained watchmakers? Is it because mechanical watchmaking is incredibly complicated? Or is there something else happening? Because if we reduce a Rolex to its basic function, we're left with a very strange product. A Rolex tells time. So does a $30 watch. And yet these two objects can exist in completely different economic worlds. That difference is where the story becomes fascinating. Because Rolex didn't become one of the world's most recognizable luxury watch brands simply by making expensive watches. The company spent more than a century building an idea around what a wristwatch could be. A watch that could survive water. A watch that could be precise. A watch that could be worn every day. A watch that could become part of a person's identity. And eventually, a watch that could represent success itself. This is the story of how Rolex built that idea. And why, more than a century later, people are still willing to pay for it. To understand Rolex, we have to go back to the beginning. The story starts with Hans Wilsdorf. In 1905, Wilsdorf established a company in London with Alfred Davis called Wilsdorf & Davis, focused on distributing watches. At the time, wristwatches were still struggling to gain the reputation of being precise and reliable instruments. Pocket watches were still the established choice. Wristwatches were often seen as less serious. And there was a technical problem. A wristwatch had to be small. Small mechanisms were difficult to manufacture with precision, and even if you could make the mechanism accurate, you still had to protect it. Dust could enter, moisture could enter, water could enter, and mechanical movements don't particularly enjoy any of those things. Wilsdorf saw an opportunity. He believed the wristwatch could become an everyday instrument, but only if it could become precise, reliable, and robust. That vision became the foundation of Rolex. In 1908, Wilsdorf registered the name Rolex. 2 years later, a Rolex wristwatch received a certificate for chronometric precision in Switzerland. In 1914, another Rolex wristwatch received a Class A certificate from Britain's Kew Observatory, a distinction historically associated with marine chronometers. This was important, because Rolex wasn't initially trying to convince people, our watch is luxurious. It was trying to convince them, our watch works. That distinction would define the brand for decades. Then Rolex attacked one of the biggest problems facing mechanical wristwatches: water. Hans Wilsdorf had been searching for a way to protect the movement from dust and moisture. In 1926, Rolex introduced the Oyster case. Its design used a screwed-down bezel, case back and winding crown to create a hermetically sealed case that protected the movement from outside elements. And Rolex didn't simply announce, "Trust us, it's waterproof." Wilsdorf understood something much more powerful: demonstrate it. In 1927, British swimmer Mercedes Gleitzer wore a Rolex Oyster during her attempt to swim across the English Channel. After the swim, the watch had continued to function and keep time. Rolex used the event as a major demonstration of the Oyster's waterproofness. Think about what just happened. Rolex had taken a technical feature and turned it into a story. The watch wasn't just waterproof, it had survived the English Channel. And that distinction matters enormously in luxury branding, because consumers rarely remember specifications as well as they remember stories. The Oyster wasn't just a case, it became a legend. Then came another major breakthrough. In 1931, Rolex introduced the perpetual rotor, an automatic winding system that used the natural movement of the wearer's wrist to wind the mechanical movement. The combination of Oyster plus perpetual would eventually become one of the defining identities of Rolex. And suddenly, Rolex had something powerful, a watch that was mechanical, automatic, waterproof, and precise. But the company wasn't finished, not even close. Here's the fascinating part. A technical innovation can be copied, A competitor can create another waterproof watch. Another company can develop an automatic movement. Another manufacturer can produce a highly accurate mechanical watch. So how does one company turn engineering into an identity? Rolex did it through consistency. Instead of constantly reinventing what the brand meant, it repeatedly reinforced the same ideas: precision, reliability, durability, exploration, performance, and achievement. Rolex associated its watches with people doing extraordinary things: explorers, divers, athletes, racing drivers, mountaineers, scientists, artists, and other people operating at the edge of their disciplines. The strategy was subtle. Rolex didn't need to say, "Our watch is extraordinary." It could show an extraordinary person wearing one. And eventually the association became automatic. A Rolex wasn't just a watch, it became a symbol of accomplishment. That's a much harder thing for a competitor to manufacture, because you can manufacture a movement, you can manufacture a bracelet, you can manufacture a case, but you cannot manufacture a century of associations overnight. Now let's put the mythology aside for a moment, because a Rolex is still a physical machine. Inside the case is a mechanical movement made from many individual components: tiny wheels, springs, jewels, bridges, levers, escapement components, and precision-machined parts working together continuously. There is no battery driving the movement, no digital processor, no screen, just mechanical energy being controlled with extraordinary precision. Rolex manufactures its movements in Bienne, Switzerland, while cases and bracelets are produced in Plain-les-Ouates. Dials and ceramic bezel components are made in Cherbourg, and development, assembly and testing are carried out at its Geneva headquarters in Acacias. Rolex says its watches are created, manufactured, assembled and tested exclusively in Switzerland. And this is one of the most important answers to our original question. Rolex controls an enormous portion of the production process itself. Instead of simply buying a movement from another manufacturer, buying a case from another company, buying a dial somewhere else, and assembling everything at the end, Rolex has built a highly integrated manufacturing system. That means greater control, more consistency, more investment, and inevitably more cost. Rolex currently says more than 9,000 employees work across its Swiss sites, with a fifth production site under construction in Boulay, Switzerland. This isn't a small workshop producing a few watches in the corner of a Swiss village. It's an enormous industrial operation, built around an object small enough to fit on your wrist. But here's where things become almost obsessive. A mechanical watch isn't simply assembled and then placed in a box. It has to be tested. And Rolex has created its own certification system around this. The superlative chronometer certification was redefined in 2015. A Rolex movement first undergoes official chronometer certification through CCOSC. Then, after the movement is placed inside the finished watch, Rolex performs another series of tests according to its own standards. The target for the finished watch is approximately -2 to +2 seconds per day. That's a remarkably tight tolerance for a mechanical device. And Rolex doesn't stop at accuracy. The certification process also evaluates things such as waterproofness, self-winding performance, power reserve, and the behavior of the completed watch under conditions intended to simulate real-world wear. And now there's an important update. In 2026, Rolex strengthened the superlative chronometer certification again. 3 additional criteria were added during design and manufacturing: magnetic resistance, reliability, and sustainability. These complement the existing criteria covering precision, waterproofness, self-winding, and power reserve. That matters because it tells us something about modern Rolex. The company isn't simply protecting an old tradition. It's continuously redefining what it considers acceptable performance. The watch may look traditional, but underneath, the standards continue to evolve. At this point, you might be thinking, if Rolex can manufacture these watches at such a large scale, why are luxury mechanical watches still so difficult to make? Because manufacturing precision isn't just about owning expensive machines. It's about controlling thousands of tiny variables: the shape of a component, the tolerance of a gear, the surface finish, the interaction between moving parts, the consistency of materials, the lubrication, the resistance to shock, the behavior of the movement in different positions, and then doing it again and again and again. Rolex says its BN facility manufactures movement components, ranging from roughly 200 to almost 400 components for the most complex calibers. That's a lot of pieces. And every one of those pieces exists inside a system where tiny errors can accumulate. A mechanical watch is fascinating precisely because it is an analog machine. We know that it doesn't simply calculate time. It physically creates the measurement of time through controlled mechanical motion. And that is why a mechanical watch can be both technologically old and technically impressive. Now we reach the uncomfortable part. Even after everything we've discussed, the manufacturing process doesn't fully explain the price of a Rolex. Because if manufacturing alone determined price, many watches would be cheaper. The rest comes from something much harder to quantify. Brand value. Rolex has spent decades building a carefully controlled identity. The crown, the Oyster, the names of its iconic collections, the visual language, the sponsorships, the explorers, the athletes, the cultural associations, the history, and the consistency. The company isn't trying to make every watch look radically different every year. Instead, many Rolex designs evolve gradually. That creates continuity. A Rolex from decades ago can still look unmistakably like a Rolex, and that creates an unusual relationship between generations. A person can inherit one, wear one, repair one, pass it to someone else, and the object continues carrying the identity of the original owner. That's something a smartphone doesn't really do. Your phone becomes obsolete. A mechanical watch can become more meaningful with age. The technology becomes less important, while the story becomes more important. And that is one reason luxury watches occupy such a strange position in modern society. They are simultaneously machines, jewelry, fashion, engineering, status symbols, and sometimes family objects. Now we can finally answer the question: why does a Rolex cost so much? The answer isn't one thing. It's a combination. You're paying for the physical materials, you're paying for engineering, you're paying for highly controlled manufacturing, you're paying for testing, you're paying for Swiss production, you're paying for research and development, you're paying for service infrastructure, you're paying for decades of accumulated knowledge, you're paying for design, you're paying for distribution and retail, you're paying for the brand, and you're paying for something economists have a much harder time measuring: desirability. But there's another distinction we should make. A Rolex isn't necessarily expensive because it is the most useful way to tell time. It isn't. Technology has already solved that problem. A Rolex is expensive because it solves a completely different problem. It answers a question people have been asking for thousands of years. How do we turn an object into a symbol of achievement? Rolex found one answer. Make the object technically excellent. Make it durable. Make it recognizable. Associate it with extraordinary human achievements. Keep the design consistent. Control the manufacturing. And then give the object enough history for people to care about it. That's why the most interesting thing about Rolex isn't actually the price. It's the transformation. A mechanical instrument that began as a solution to a practical problem became a cultural symbol. The Oyster was about protecting a movement from water. The perpetual rotor was about keeping it wound. Chronometer certification was about precision. But over time, those technical achievements became part of a much bigger story. Reliability became reputation, precision became prestige, durability became legacy, and the watch became something much more than a machine. Think about that little crown on the dial. It's one of the most recognizable symbols in the watch industry. But behind it is a story that began with a simple problem. How do you make a wristwatch precise enough to be trusted? How do you protect it from water? How do you make it reliable enough for everyday life? How do you prove that it works? And eventually, how do you convince the world that the object on your wrist represents something bigger than the object itself? Rolex spent more than a century answering those questions. Today, the company continues manufacturing its watches in Switzerland, maintaining tightly controlled production and testing processes while strengthening its certification standards in 2026. But perhaps the greatest achievement isn't inside the movement, it's inside our perception. Because when you look at a Rolex, you don't simply see gears. You see history. You see exploration. You see craftsmanship. You see achievement. You see status. And sometimes you see yourself. That's the real secret of luxury. The most powerful luxury products don't just tell you what they are, they tell you what owning them means. A Rolex began as an attempt to make a better wristwatch. More than a century later, it has become something far more complicated. A machine, a piece of engineering, a piece of jewelry, a cultural symbol, and for some people, a piece of their story. So the next time you see a Rolex, don't just ask, why is this watch so expensive? Ask something more interesting. How did a machine designed to measure time become valuable enough to represent it? Because that's where the real story begins. This is Rolex, and this is what lies behind the crown.